On the evening of April 14, 1982, a boy of 7 in Leningrad caught a few quiet words that later pushed the state to kill his parents. The boy was Dmitry Kazakov. His father, Anatoly, worked as a mid-level engineer at a defense research site in the city. His mother, Elena, taught literature at a nearby school. From the outside, they looked like the usual Soviet family. They stayed out of the spotlight, followed rules, and tried not to draw attention. Nothing about them hinted at risk or rebellion. But in the early months of 1982, they made a choice that stripped them of the life they had. They chose to defect. How they reached that choice is still murky. Some parts became clearer only years later through interrogation notes and scattered testimonies. What we do know is that Anatoly and Elena had permission for a family trip to Bulgaria at the end of May that year. Trips there were common and considered safe inside the Eastern Bloc. Getting approval was routine and no one questioned their request. But the Kazakovs never meant to return home. Interrogation files say they planned to slip into Yugoslavia while in Bulgaria and then head toward Austria. Once in Austria, they hoped to ask for asylum and start over somewhere in the West. The plan needed silence, not caution, absolute silence. One hint, one odd remark, one careless detail could spark suspicion. And when suspicion started, the system did the rest. That was exactly what happened to them. To understand why the Kazakovs even thought of leaving, you have to picture everyday life in the Soviet Union in 1982. This was the final stretch of the Brezhnev era, the period later labeled the era of stagnation. The economy dragged. Store shelves stayed thin. People grew tired of slogans that no longer matched reality. Educated citizens felt especially boxed in, surrounded by ideology that demanded obedience and discouraged open thought. Many wanted air. Few dared to look for it. Anatoly Kazakov had been at the Leningrad Defense Research Site since 1976. He designed small components for military radio systems. His work didn't involve top-tier secrets. He wasn't shaping nuclear weapons or new missile systems, but his projects still counted as sensitive. His files stayed in the hands of the facility's security branch, and his activities were checked from time to time. Anyone in defense work lived under heavier scrutiny than ordinary citizens. The state valued them but never fully trusted them. Elena had spent 9 years teaching 5th and 6th grade literature by 1982. Former co-workers later said she was steady, patient, and good with students. But teaching under Soviet rules meant you were always balancing honesty with caution. A simple class discussion could slide into dangerous territory if it didn't align with the party line. Books weren't just books. Each one carried political weight.
Teachers knew this and shaped every sentence with care. They had one child, Dmitry, born in October of 1974, and in that small apartment in Leningrad, the three of them tried to build a quiet life. They didn't know that a single overheard conversation on that April night would be enough to set everything in motion and erase the future they were trying to reach. He was a quiet kid, a bit withdrawn in class, as his teachers liked to say, but he paid attention and asked sharp questions when something caught his interest. He went to school number 47 in the Fruny district, the same place where his mother worked, though she never taught his group. Friends who later spoke about him remembered a boy who stuck by people, who treated small promises like they mattered. The Kazakovs lived in a typical Soviet block on Bukhareskaya Street, a plain concrete building put up in the 1960s during Khrushchev's big housing push. Their flat was tight for 3 people, 2 small bedrooms, a thin kitchen where only one person could move at a time, and a bathroom where the hot water came and went without warning. Most families in Leningrad lived the same way then. Their neighbors were workers, teachers, minor officials, and pensioners who moved through the halls with slow steps. The walls were so thin that everyone heard everyone else. Privacy was something people talked about, but rarely got. Dmitri later told his grandmother, in one of the rare moments he opened up about those years, that he had pressed his ear to his parents' bedroom door the night it happened. He said he had sensed a shift long before that evening. His parents had grown stiff around each other, dropping their voices to a hush whenever he came close. Dinners stretched out in quiet, forks tapping plates while no one said much of anything. His mother kept drifting off, forgetting to ask about school or even remind him to finish his homework. That night, he heard them mention Bulgaria and the vacation they had been granted, but the talk didn't sound like planning for a simple trip. They spoke about Yugoslavia, about slipping across a border, about someone waiting who could guide them once they arrived. His father's voice carried a hard edge. His mother sounded scared, yet she kept agreeing with him. She said she could not keep raising their son in a place where his future was already written for him before he even grew up. Dmitri didn't catch every word, but he caught the meaning. They wanted to leave for good. They were thinking about the West. They realized he was listening. He said his father pulled him inside and told him straight that he had to forget what he heard. His mother was crying before he even spoke. They made him promise to keep quiet. They insisted it was only talk about a holiday, nothing important, but he must not repeat any of it. Not to friends, not to teachers, not to anyone at all.
He agreed, though promises made by 7-year-olds, no matter how sincere, don't always hold steady. In the next 2 weeks, Dmitri started spotting things that matched the secret he wasn't supposed to know. His mother placed odd items in the luggage. She folded her mother's lace tablecloth, the one saved for special days, and slid it into a suitcase as if it were something essential. She added photo albums, not only the recent ones, but the older books filled with relatives he had never met. She wrapped his father's watch, the heirloom passed down from Anatoly's grandfather, in a thick piece of cloth and tucked it deep into a side pocket where no one would notice. These were not the choices of people getting ready for a short vacation. They were the choices of people preparing to leave for good, with no plan to return. Dmitri sensed this, even if he could not grasp every detail, and the mix of that heavy truth and the secret he had sworn to protect must have weighed hard on a child so young. In mid-May, a little less than 10 days before the family was supposed to depart for Bulgaria, Dmitri was in the courtyard of his apartment block, playing with his closest friend, an 8-year-old boy named Mikhail Petro. The courtyard was a shared rectangle of cracked concrete and thin, patchy grass, hemmed in by rows of the same plain buildings. There was a rusted swing set that groaned when used, a slide with a broken edge, and a low wall where the kids liked to sit, trade stories, and rest between games. The boys had known each other for almost their whole lives. They had lived next door since Dmitri had been 2 years old. They had started school at the same time, spent nearly every afternoon in that courtyard, and, as many neighbors later said, treated each other like brothers rather than friends. At some point that day, Dmitri told Mikhail that his family was leaving. He said they were going west and would never return. He told him this was goodbye. No one knows the exact shape of that talk. No one knows whether Mikhail asked for more or whether Dmitri shared it without hesitation. What is clear is that Mikhail believed him completely, and that belief was strong enough to send him home later that evening to tell his parents what he had heard. And this is where everything shifted, because Mikhail's father was a police officer. Victor Petro served as a sergeant in the Leningrad militia. He had joined in 1970, right after finishing his military duty, and had worked his way up from street patrol to a post in the administrative office of the local precinct. People who worked with him said he was steady and serious, a man who valued order, who thought his role was to protect the structure of Soviet life. When his son came home with his story,
Victor did not wave it off as childish imagination. Later accounts say he made Mikuel repeat Dimitri's words exactly.
He asked where they had been standing, whether anyone else might have heard them, and whether his son was completely sure about what had been said. Mikuel answered as plainly as he could. He was 8, and he trusted his father. He did not think his honesty could cause trouble for anyone. But Victor understood the stakes. He knew that Anatoly Kazakov worked in the defense sector. He had seen Anatoly leave each morning in his engineer's clothes with his identification papers. He knew that the defection of a defense employee was treated as a serious matter, and that even a hint of such an attempt had to be reported. So the next morning, May 16, 1982, Victor submitted a formal report to his superior at the militia station. The report was short, almost bare, and it stressed that the source was his son, Mikhail, and that the story itself was passed along by children, which made it shaky from the start. Still, the note also pointed out that if there was any truth to it, the situation could turn serious. The officer who wrote it added where Anatoly worked and mentioned that the family already had permission for a foreign trip set for May 27th. That detail alone pushed the file upward fast. Within a single day, the local militia sent it to the Leningrad branch of the Committee for State Security, the KGB, where it landed among the countless tips that arrived each year. The Soviet system trained people to watch each other, and most citizens understood that passing along rumors or suspicions counted as both a public duty and a kind of personal insurance. As a result, most of the reports the KGB received went nowhere. Neighbors accused neighbors over arguments about noise or shared walls. Co-workers tried to undermine rivals by hinting at disloyalty or odd behavior. Much of it was petty, confused, exaggerated, or simply invented. But this particular report had a mix of factors that made the officers pause. The first issue was Anatoly's job in the defense sector. His rank wasn't high, and he likely had no access to core secrets. Yet anyone tied to defense work who tried to travel abroad was treated as a possible threat. The risk wasn't only about information leaking. It was about the message a defection could send, about the possibility that others might follow, about the fear that even small cracks in control could widen. The second point was the timing. The Kazakov family already had a foreign trip authorized, and the date was close. If they were thinking about fleeing, this would be their chance. But the third part made the whole thing fragile. The claim rested on what an 8-year-old boy said, and he himself had heard it from a 7-year-old friend. Children mishear things, twist them, repeat them without context, or invent details without meaning to. The KGB couldn't drag Anatoly Kazakov into custody on something passed along in a schoolyard. They needed something solid.
They needed proof, and they needed it fast, well before the family boarded a train or plane bound for Bulgaria. So the Leningrad KGB's second chief directorate, the branch responsible for internal security and counterintelligence, authorized surveillance. A file was opened, marked with the number 4788K, and specific officers were told to follow the family. The operation that started on May 17, 1982, didn't look unusual on paper. Teams watched the entrance of the Kazakov building, writing down the times Anatoly left for work and the times he returned. They followed Alana through her day, noting her routine at the school where she taught, the stalls she visited in the market, the path she took home each night. A tap went onto the family's phone line, though later notes show they barely used the phone during those days. At the same time, other officers pulled Anatoly's employment file from the defense facility. They checked old evaluations, attendance records, comments from supervisors, anything that might hint at frustration, political doubts, or small slips in loyalty. They weren't expecting dramatic revelations. They were looking for tiny signs, the kind that might help them decide whether this tip from 2 children was nonsense or the start of something far more serious. They started by checking if he had asked for any odd bits of information or tried to reach materials that had nothing to do with his usual duties. They also asked around to see if anyone at work had spotted strange behavior. Nothing pointed to trouble. Anatoly looked, on paper and in daily life, like a steady, ordinary employee who did his job without drawing attention. Still, the surveillance team kept at it. They waited for a clear sign, something that would fit the pattern they had been trained to notice. They watched for a link to a facilitator, a quiet meeting, any careful move that might show he was planning to defect. And on May 20th, exactly 3 days after the watch began and 7 days before the family was set to leave, they finally saw what they needed. Anatoly met a man in a small cafe near the Neva River. The place was simple, the sort of spot where workers stopped for a cup of tea before heading home. The meeting happened around 6 in the evening, not long after Anatoly finished work. He chose a corner table and sat across from someone the team recognized right away. His name was Grigory Lyadev, a man who already had a file with the KGB. Lyadev was believed to be a facilitator, someone who arranged illegal border crossings for people trying to flee the Soviet Union. He had been watched off and on for more than a year, but he never slipped up enough to be detained. He kept his meetings short, moved around often, and avoided anything that could be used against him. In 10 minutes, the Lyadev and Anatoly talk was over.
No one handed over papers or anything else the watchers could catch on camera. When they were done, they parted fast, with no handshake or sign that they knew each other well. Even so, the meeting itself changed everything. Together with the warning from Viktor Petrov, it was enough to confirm intent. The KGB acted right away. There was no space for longer observation and no reason to wait for more evidence. In 7 days, the family would be on their way to Bulgaria. If the Kazakovs reached that train, crossed into Bulgaria, and continued on toward Yugoslavia, they would be gone for good. Losing a defense worker to the West would count as both a security failure and a public embarrassment. So on the evening of May 21st, 1982, 2 black Volga sedans stopped in front of the apartment block on Bucharestaya Street. 6 KGB officers, all dressed in plain clothes, went inside and climbed to the 3rd floor. Several neighbors later shared what they saw. A firm knock hit the Kazakov door. When Anatoly opened it, the officer stated who they were and said he needed to come with them for questioning. Elena stepped into view, demanding an explanation and asking what charges they were talking about. They told her she needed to come too. Dmitry was still in the apartment. One neighbor who happened to be standing in the hallway said the boy was led out by one of the officers, looking lost and calling for his mother as they took him away. Elena reached toward him, but the officers blocked her and forced them apart. They put Dmitry in another car, far from his parents, and that ride became the last moment he would be anywhere near them. Anatoly and Elena Kazakov were sent to different KGB detention sites, each isolated from the other. Dmitry ended up in a state-run home on the edge of the city, a place that held children whose parents had been arrested or labeled unfit, keeping them there until officials decided what to do next. The interrogation of Anatoly and Elena started right away. The KGB methods from that era are no secret now. They relied on cutting people off from any support, keeping them awake for long stretches, applying steady psychological pressure, and circling back with the same questions until the person broke down. The interrogators already had the surveillance reports, the brief meeting with Lyadev, the tapped phone calls, and whatever else they had managed to gather in those few days. Still, that wasn't enough for them. They wanted a clean confession, a full layout of the plan, and a list of anyone who might have been involved. According to interrogation logs later pulled from the archives, Anatoly held out for roughly 3 days. He first denied that he meant to defect. He said the meeting with Lyadev was pure chance, repeated that the Bulgaria trip was nothing more than a family vacation, and tried to stay firm.
But by the 4th day, exhaustion and pressure caught up with him, and he finally told them the truth. He admitted that he and Elena had been preparing to defect for about 4 months. He said they had reached Lviv through an acquaintance whose name he refused to give. He described the plan: travel to Bulgaria with official approval, move on foot across a mountain path into Yugoslavia that Ledviv had pointed out, then continue toward Austria and request asylum at either an American or British embassy. He acknowledged that he knew the act was illegal, that it counted as betrayal of the Soviet Union, yet he said he did it for his son. He wanted Dmitry to grow up somewhere he could speak his mind, think without fear, and shape a future not tied to party loyalty or rigid ideology. He told them he would accept whatever punishment the state chose, but he begged them to spare his wife, saying she had only agreed because he pushed for it. The interrogators brushed that aside. Alina faced her own questioning in another room. Her statements matched Anatoly's. She admitted she had known about the plan, supported it, and helped prepare for it. She talked about what she packed, including photo albums and family heirlooms she couldn't imagine leaving behind. Under Soviet law then, any attempt at defection by someone working in the defense sector fell under treason, defined in Article 64 of the RSFSR Criminal Code. The article described treason as a deliberate act by a citizen of the USSR meant to harm the independence of the state, its territorial unity, or the strength of its armed forces. In that system, defection automatically fell into this category, especially when the person involved had access to sensitive material or worked anywhere near state security. The punishment was death, stated plainly and without exceptions. The law allowed no uncertainty, no space for excuses or special circumstances. Intent alone was treated as enough to secure a conviction. So the fact that Anatoly and Alina Kazakov had not yet made it out, that they were stopped before they even reached the train headed for Bulgaria, changed nothing inside the rigid legal rules of that era. The trial took place before a closed military tribunal on June 28, 1982. These hearings were sealed off from the public. No reporters attended, and no outside witness saw any part of it. Everything that happened was written down by hand or typed into official records, and those documents were classified the moment the session ended. The entire process ran for roughly 4 hours. The prosecution laid out its case, showing surveillance notes, reports from field officers, records of the meeting with Ledviv, and the confessions both defendants had signed. There was no attempt at a defense, which was common in treason cases where the outcome was all but fixed.
Although Soviet law claimed to protect the presumption of innocence, that idea held little meaning whenever state security came into play. The judgment was issued that same day. Anatoly Kazakov and Yelena Kazakov were both declared guilty under Article 64. The court sentenced them to death by firing squad. There was no appeal system available for charges like this. Once the tribunal spoke, the matter was closed forever. On July 2, 1982, around 6 o'clock in the morning, Anatoly and Yelena Kazakov were executed at a site outside Leningrad. A military firing squad carried out the sentence, following the usual procedure for treason. Their bodies were withheld from the family, and they were placed in unmarked graves at a location that was never revealed. Their deaths remained unmentioned in public records. No obituary surfaced, and their names vanished from official documents whenever removal was possible. Their apartment on Bucharest Street went to another family within 2 weeks. The defense facility where Anatoly had been employed stayed silent and erased any trace of his time there. In practice, the state treated both of them as if they had never lived. Meanwhile, their son Dmitry entered the state care system. The first facility that received him served only as a temporary stop. Within 1 week of his parents' arrest, he was moved to a children's home in the Novgorod region, roughly 200 kilometers from Leningrad. His grandmother, Klavdia Kazakova, reached the Leningrad facility 4 days after the arrest. She was 63 years old then, had been a widow for 7 years, and survived on a modest pension while living in a communal apartment in the Moskovsky district. When she heard that her son and daughter-in-law had been taken into custody, she went straight to the officials and asked to take care of Dmitry herself. They turned her down. Later papers from the state archives said the same thing again and again.
Children of people labeled as traitors had to be kept under strict control so the state could shape their views from an early age. The authorities believed these children might absorb the same anti-state ideas as their parents, so the usual answer was to send them to state institutions where every lesson, habit, and behavior could be watched. Klavdia was allowed to see Dmitri, but only in a controlled room, only when the staff allowed it, and never outside the facility. She kept asking for a different ruling. Over the next months, she wrote many letters, all addressed to different offices and different clerks, trying to explain that she had always been loyal, that she could raise her grandson safely, that she only wanted to give him a normal home. None of those attempts worked. Each reply, when one even arrived, repeated that the decision stood. The final time she met Dmitri as a small boy was in August of 1982 in the children's home in Novgorod.
She rode the train with a small bundle of sweets and an old picture of Anatoly from his youth. Dmitri looked at her and asked where his parents had gone. She had no real answer. The officials never told her about the execution. They only said the case was finished and that Anatoly and Elena would not return. So she told the boy that his parents were far away, that they would come back when they were able. She knew it was untrue, but she could not bring herself to say anything harsher to a 7-year-old child. Dmitri then spent the next 11 years inside the state system. He was moved repeatedly, a pattern the authorities used to stop children from forming strong ties to any one place or adult. He stayed in Novgorod, then in a center outside Leningrad, then in other facilities that followed the same pattern. He attended the usual state schools, learned the approved lessons, and went through the routine without causing problems. People who remembered him from those years said he kept to himself. He rarely spoke unless needed. He avoided games, group tasks, and anything noisy. Most of his free hours were spent reading whatever he could find or sitting off to the side. Teachers wrote that he was bright enough, but showed little drive. He finished the work, but never pushed further or showed interest in any subject. His grandmother visited when her health allowed it. As the years passed, the trips became harder for her. The grief of losing her son and the constant worry for her grandson wore her down. She sent him letters during the long stretches when she could not travel, though she never knew whether each one reached him or ended up forgotten in some drawer. When Dmitri turned 18 in October of 1992, the state finally released him from its control. The Soviet Union had fallen the year before, and the old machinery that had taken him away no longer worked the same way. He received a small payment from the state and was given a room in a communal apartment in St. Petersburg. The city that had been called Leningrad when his parents were still alive, was the place where he ended up registering at the local employment office. They sent him to a warehouse where he worked as a stock clerk. It was simple work, paid little, and asked almost nothing of him. No training, no future, nothing that would shape a life. He lived on his own, kept his doors shut, and barely spoke to the people who lived a few steps away. Anyone watching him would have said he preferred silence, but he wasn't drifting. He was searching. He needed to understand what had happened to his parents. In the first months of 1993, Dmitri began pushing his way through the leftovers of the old Soviet bureaucracy, trying to reach files that had been locked away for more than a decade. He walked from office to office, filled out forms that no one had updated in years, and asked questions that most clerks brushed aside or claimed they couldn't answer.
Many archives were a mess after the fall of the USSR. Boxes had been moved without records, papers had vanished, and some documents had been burned or shredded on purpose. The KGB no longer existed in its old shape, replaced by new organizations, and many former officers kept quiet about anything tied to the Soviet period. Even so, Dmitri didn't let up. He filed official requests under new transparency laws from the early 1990s. On paper, those laws gave citizens the right to learn what had happened to their own families. When he had to, he bent the truth. He said he needed medical documents. He said he was doing research. He said whatever he thought might push someone to actually pull a file from a shelf instead of sending him home empty-handed. Most times, nothing happened. But in early September 1993, he finally met someone who didn't turn him away. Her name didn't survive in any record, but according to what Dmitry later told his grandmother, she was a middle-aged woman working in a department that still handled old KGB archives. She saw how desperate he was. She understood he wasn't chasing some abstract curiosity, but trying to piece together the story of his own life. So she agreed to help, quietly, after hours, when the building had emptied out and no one would question her. She found the file. When she spoke to him, she tried to soften the blow, but there was no gentle way to say it. His parents had been arrested in May 1982, charged with treason, put on trial, and executed in July of that same year. She showed him the dates and the official statements. She didn't show him everything. Parts of the file were still restricted, but she showed enough for him to understand the truth. Then she explained how the whole thing had started. She said the investigation began with a report submitted by a militia officer named Viktor Petrov. The source behind that report had been Petrov's 8-year-old son, Mikhail, and Mikhail had heard the information from Dmitry himself. That tip led to surveillance. The surveillance led to the arrests. Dmitry didn't need any further detail. He remembered Mikhail. He remembered the courtyard, the wall they sat on, the careless words he'd spoken as a child. And in that moment he saw, with a kind of cold and crushing clarity, the chain he had unknowingly set in motion. He walked out of the records office and moved through the streets of St. Petersburg for hours, unable to do anything else. The city was still trying to figure out what it had become after the post-Soviet years. Old imperial facades pushed through layers of dirt, the cracks and stains showing how long they had been ignored. Early fall brought sharp cold and flat gray light. Dmitry moved through the streets with no plan. He let his thoughts run in circles, replaying the same moments again and again. By evening, he went back to his room. He skipped dinner.
He sat at his small table for a long time before picking up a pen. The note he wrote stayed short. He laid out what he had learned that day, how his own words had started everything, and what that truth meant for him now. He said he did not blame Mikhail. He did not blame Viktor Petrov. He did not blame the KGB or the Soviet system. He put all of it on himself. He wrote that he had brought about the deaths of his parents, that he had torn apart his family, and that living with that knowledge felt impossible. On the night of September 8, 1993, Dmitry Kozakov hanged himself in his apartment. His landlord found him the next morning when he came by to collect rent. Dmitry was 18 years old. The police took the note, added it to the incident file, and marked the death as suicide. Cause of death was listed as asphyxiation. No one opened an inquiry. No one followed up. The Soviet Union was gone. The KGB was gone. And Dmitry Kozakov became one more loss tied to a system that had already dissolved. His grandmother received the call. She took his body and arranged the burial herself. She chose a cemetery on the edge of St. Petersburg, picking a plot close to the place where she believed, though she never proved it, that her son and daughter-in-law had been buried. She set a plain marker with his name and his dates. She died 14 months later, losing her son, her daughter-in-law, and then her grandson across 13 years broke something in her that never healed. She was 76 when she passed. Neighbors said she spent her last year talking about Dmitry all the time.
asking herself whether she had missed some sign, whether there had been any small chance to save him. The story of the Kazakov family stayed mostly hidden. Case file 4778K remained in the archives, open only to researchers with the right clearance. Only in the late 1990s did anything begin to surface, when a Russian journalist studying KGB cases from the 1980s came across the file. His piece, printed in a small Russian historical journal in 1998, pointed out the harsh irony. A child's simple words had set off a chain that ended in the execution of his parents and, years later, his own death. The article was brief, under 2,000 words, and almost no one outside academic circles noticed it. Still, the Kazakov case shows more than a single family's pain. It reveals how the Soviet system of watching, reporting, and extracting information worked day to day. How it depended on regular people informing on each other, and how even the most harmless remark could be turned into a weapon by the state. Viktor Petrov, the police officer who filed the first report, acted exactly the way the system trained him. He got a tip that hinted at a possible crime, and he passed it through the usual chain because that was his job. In his view, he was guarding state security and doing what any proper officer should.
Nothing suggests he ever felt regret about sending that report forward. There's no sign he thought he carried any personal blame for what later happened to the Kazakov family. He stayed in the militia until he retired in 1991. He died in 2003 at the age of 61. A small obituary in a local paper noted his death and described him as a steady, loyal public worker, nothing more. Mikhail Petrov, his son, has never said anything in public about the case. People have tried to reach him for interviews, but no one has managed to speak with him. No one knows if he ever learned the full story of what happened to Dmitry and his parents, or if he feels any weight from it. Maybe he tried to forget events that took place when he was still a kid. Maybe he never heard the details at all. His silence leaves only questions. The facilitator, Gregory Lidwov, was arrested in 1984 on other charges and sent to a labor camp for 10 years. He left the camp in 1994 and then vanished from the official record. No one knows where he went or what became of him afterward. The whole idea of responsibility in situations like this gets messy fast. You end up trying to assign blame among people who were, in their own ways, following the rules and expectations of the world they lived in. Can a 7-year-old be judged for failing to grasp how far his words might spread? Can an 8-year-old be blamed for trusting a parent with something he thought was harmless? Can a police officer be condemned for obeying the law as it stood at the time? The honest answer is probably no. But the truth doesn't soften the outcome. It doesn't bring Anatoly and Elena Kazakov back. It doesn't erase the long years Dmitry spent in state care, waiting for parents who never returned. It doesn't quiet the guilt that hit him when he finally learned what happened. The Kazakov case shows how a totalitarian system actually works in practice. It doesn't need cartoon villains. It runs through the everyday cooperation of people who think they're doing the proper thing. Viktor Petrov wasn't a monster. He was a man who believed in rules and felt he was protecting society. Mikhail wasn't cruel. He was a child sharing something he thought mattered. Even the KGB officers who listened, watched, and questioned believed they were shielding the Soviet Union from threats. But the system they served was built to crush anyone who stepped outside its reach. It lived on fear, on the sense that every word might be overheard, that any person might report you, that even a small slip could bring an arrest. Anatoly and Elena Kazakov only wanted a different kind of future for their son. They hoped he could grow up somewhere he could talk without fear, think his own thoughts, and not have his whole path fixed by party demands or some strict ideology. They wanted a place where his future was shaped by choice, not by rules written far above him.
For that small shot at freedom, they were ready to risk their home, their status,
and even their lives. But the system they tried to flee wrapped itself around everything. It pushed into schools, workplaces, kitchens, and playgrounds. It listened to jokes, rumors, and even the careless phrases kids said when they didn't know any better. It could twist a simple comment into proof of disloyalty. By the time Dmitry understood what his innocent words had triggered, the Soviet Union was gone. The KGB didn't exist anymore. The ideas that once justified the arrest and execution of people like his parents had been tossed aside by history. But none of that eased anything for him. His parents were still gone. His early years were still taken from him. The weight he carried never lifted, and he kept blaming himself for something he never meant to cause. After the fall of the USSR, stories like the Kazakovs started to surface, first in scattered reports, then in academic work, and later in the writings of people who lived through those years. These accounts show what that system did to regular families. They paint a picture of a state that prized obedience over truth, doctrine over compassion, and its own survival over any one person's life. They remind readers how power can twist everyday routines into something dangerous. There is no memorial for the Kazakovs, no plaque, no statue, no official record that the public ever sees. Their names stay hidden in old folders and faded papers left from the 1980s. Only a small group of researchers who sift through those files know the full outline of their story. But their case mirrors thousands of others, each one carrying the same quiet proof of what total control can cost. These were lives shattered not by open conflict or hunger, but by a system that trained neighbors to report on neighbors and taught people to fear their own children's voices. Dmitry Kazakov was 7 years old when he made a small mistake that he couldn't take back. He was 18 when he died, still thinking he had caused his parents' deaths. And between those 2 points, he lost his family, his safety, and any sense of who he might have become.